Have you ever been somewhere so quiet that it seemed like the silence itself was humming? It wasn't the lack of sound, it was something deeper, like a hand pressing against your ears to keep you from hearing what was below. If so, you may already know what I'm about to say. I have a question for you before we start. Where are you sitting to listen? Enter it in the box below. When these stories start, I always want to know where they go. Trust me, after tonight you're going to. You want to know that you heard this too. Now, take a seat. It will take a while to finish this, but it will be worth it. It was 1923. At that time, the least known part of West Virginia was the Hill Country. There was a county there that wasn't shown on many maps from that time. There was a rough area stuck between two ridgeal lines where the fog always came in at night and never quite left by morning. People who lived there called it Mason County, but Mason County, which is farther north and more famous, is almost nothing compared to this county. The land here was scarred from decades of failed wood and mining companies that came, took what they could, and then left, leaving behind people who were either too stubborn or too broken to leave. The Crenshaw place was on the edge of this county, where the road went from hard dirt to even worse conditions. It had been in the same family for more than 60 years. It was therein. In the fall of 1923, Virgil Crenshaw became the first person to notice that the land was not right. Virgil was 44 years old and used to work as a railroad surveyor. He had just come home after nearly 20 years of mapping tracks for the Norfolk and Western line through the Appalachian corridors. He was thin and worn down from the elements. His face looked like it was cut from the same sandstone that lined the creek beds next to his house. His hands were huge, and the knuckles were scarred from years of driving, putting stakes into frozen ground, and an accident with a theodolite in 1911 left his left eye permanently squinted. The way he walked made me think he had learned a long time ago that the mountains don't like people who are impatient. Virgil Crenshaw had been taking care of the Crenshaw farm by herself since his father died in 1918, and he got a letter from his cousin, Dorothy the Sable, who was 61 years old. This made him return to Mason County. Dorothy was a smart woman who kept her silver hair in a neat style, pinned so tightly that it seemed to pull her whole face up into a suspicious look all the time. She had hands that were strong enough to kill a pig, and writing that was so neat it looked like it was typed. Dorothy was not scared of anything. The family always said that. Virgil packed his bags that same night when her letter arrived at his boarding house in Roanoke. It was written in that perfect script, but the words shook in a way that the handwriting didn't. This is all the letter said. The ground here has begun to whisper, and it's no longer clear to me that it's the wind. But Virgil wasn't superstitious. He had been a surveyor for 20 years and learned to trust numbers, angles, and the hard truths of math. He knew Dorothy, though, so he knew that if she wrote something like that, she meant it however she saw it. And it was important to respect that understanding. In late October, he got there on a Tuesday. The trees were already bare, and the ridgeline against the clear sky looked like a row of broken teeth. The road to the land went through a thick forest that was dark even during the day. Inside, it was like it was always dusk. As the rented car shook along the last mile, Virgil noticed that there were no birds. He heard only the crunch of gravel under the tires and the odd groan of branches rubbing against each other in the sky. The driver, a 47-year-old local man named Purnell Skaggs, had a thick neck, was constantly sunburned, had a jaw like a brick, and eyes that were too far into his head. He didn't say a word, for most of the trip. That is, until they came around the last turn and saw the Crenshaw property. He cleared his throat and said something that Virgil would never forget. He asked, "Do you hear that?" I listened, Virgil. He didn't hear anything. Purnell said, "That's what I mean," but he didn't say more. The Crenshaw property was a big listing farmhouse with a porch that went all the way around and was starting to sag on the east side. There was a barn and a smokehouse behind it, and further back at the latrine was the opening to a small mining shaft that had fallen and been sealed with wood a long time ago. Virgil walked up to Doratha, who was standing on the porch. She didn't wave. She did nothing but watch him come closer with those sharp, upward-pulling eyes. She told him it's louder at night, when he got to the bottom step. They sat in the kitchen, which smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs, and Ortha told him what had been going on. She said it had begun about 6 weeks before, early in the beginning of September. At first, she thought it was the rainwater moving under the house, a low murmur with a steady beat, like a person caught in another room just outside of hearing range. She said it came from the floor, the walls, and the foundation stones. If she stood still for long enough, she could feel it in her feet. It changed after that. The sound had taken on a rhythm by the 3rd week. Not exactly words, but something that spoke like language, patterns that. It sounded like the sound was trying to figure out what it meant by repeating and shifting. One night, Dorothea put her ear to the floor and felt what she called a sound that let her know I was listening. He slept in his old room on the 2nd floor that first night. The bed was the same one he had slept in as a young man, and the water spot on the ceiling that looked like a hand was still there. He had stared at it many nights as a child. He was out in the dark and heard. Nothing for the first hour. Then, just after midnight, he felt it, not heard it. He could feel a very faint shaking going up through the bed frame and into the base of his head. There was also something in that tremor that wasn't sound or quiet, but something in between that had texture and direction. It came from under the house. There was no sleep for Virgil that night. By morning, the feeling was gone, and in the soft fall light, the house looked just like any other house. He checked the base, the well, and the old root cellar as he walked around the outside with Doratha. Everything looked like it was built well. The door to the mine pit at the tree line was still locked. The wooden barrier was still there, but Virgil noticed that the ground around it looked darker than he remembered, like something was seeping up from below. Things got into a pattern for Virgil over the next few days. During the day, he looked over the land with the careful eye of a surveyor, taking measurements, making notes, and making a list. He looked at the soil's density. He checked how much water was in the well. He even brought a plumb line down to the cellar to see if the base had moved. Everything was within the normal range of things. That being said, the whispers came back every night just after 1 o'clock in the morning, and it got louder. By the 5th night, Virgil could tell that the sound was making him more uncomfortable than anything else. It wasn't a mishap. What was making this noise was not physical. He knew these sounds from working near mines for many years, and the tunnels were a mess. They shook, groaned, and cracked without a pattern. It had a pattern. This had beat. This was meant to be. On the 7th night, he brought a stethoscope that he had borrowed from the county doctor, a 53-year-old man named Fenimore Gratch, whose eyes looked like they belonged to something much bigger. Even though Fenimore didn't believe Virgil when he talked about the sounds, he still let him borrow the stethoscope. Anything that bothers Dorothy Sable. You should pay attention to what Fenimore said. Virgil put the stethoscope to the cellar floor at 1:15 in the morning. What he heard made him sit back so quickly that he almost fell. The whispering was no longer vague. It was voices, not just one voice, but many voices layered on top of each other like pages in a book that are too tightly bound together. He couldn't make out individual words, but the rhythm was clearly human, rising and falling, pausing and starting again, as if a group of unseen speakers were meeting. He didn't tell Dorotha what he heard yet. Instead, the next day, he went back to Fenimore and asked, "What do you know about the history of the mine behind the Crenshaw property?" This question surprised both of them. Fenimore sat down with his coffee and looked at Virgil for a long time. "More than I would like to," Virgil said. "Let me pause here for a moment. If you're enjoying this story, you're listening to Fear. If you haven't already, click the subscribe button. If you hear this on another channel, please know that they stole our content without permission. Please let us know and come find the original. We appreciate all of you. Now, let me tell you what Fenimore told Virgil that morning. The mine behind the Cello property was called the Pendergast Shaft, after the speculator from Philadelphia named Harmon Pendergast, who paid for it to be built in 1871, but had never set foot in the area. West Virginia, but who bought mineral rights to several hundred acres of hillside in Mason County, based on a geological survey that showed unusually dense coal deposits. The mine ran for about 11 years, hiring between 30 and 60 men, most of whom were locals who had no other way to make money. It was not a happy place to work. The shaft was narrow, there wasn't enough airflow, and the rock could collapse at any time. Company just dug up the tunnels and sent the men back in, but it was the final collapse in 1882 that ended the mine, and some say started everything else. In November of that year, a part of the deepest tunnel gave way. Fenimore saw a copy of the official report in the county records office, which said that the collapse was caused by too much blasting in unstable strata, and 14 men were trapped. A rescue effort was made, but after 9 days of digging, the company called off the effort. 14 men were suffocated in the dark. And here's what Fenimore said quietly as he leaned forward in his chair. This wasn't in the official report, but it had been passed down through the families of Mason County like a scar through generations. They heard them. For weeks after the shaft was sealed, people who lived near the mine said they heard muffled rhythmic sounds coming from the ground. Some said it was knocking, others said it was singing, and others said it was both. People said it was something that didn't sound like men at all, but like what men had become in the dark. After 2 months, the sound stopped, and the Pendergast Mining Company sold the land to Virgil's grandfather for such a low price that it was almost like they were sorry. Virgil thought about this information for the rest of the day. He walked the property again, but this time with fresh eyes. He stood at the mine entrance and put his hand on the wooden barricade. It was cold, but not the cold of winter. There was a deeper cold in the air that night, like when the sun hasn't reached a spot in decades. He didn't go to the cellar. Instead, he went to the mine. He brought a lantern and a crowbar, and at midnight, he pried loose the first of the wooden boards. The air that came out wasn't old, like he thought it would be from a shaft that had been sealed for over 40 years. It was moving like the mine was breathing. He went inside. The shaft was narrow, just big enough for a man. To walk, he had to touch both walls with his elbows. The floor was wet and uneven, with broken pieces of rock and the rusted remains of old rail tracks that had once carried orchards. His lantern cast shadows that moved in ways he couldn't explain, stretching and contracting as if the walls were moving. He walked for about 200 feet before the shaft opened into a wider chamber. He thought this had been a place where tunnels split off in different directions. There were holes in the far wall, and each one was darker than the last, and let out the same steady, cold breath. Then Virgil heard it directly, not through the stone or the floorboards. Whispering, it filled the room like water filling a basin, rising from the floor, falling from the ceiling, and pressing in from the tunnel mouths. For the first time, Virgil could almost make out words. They were broken up and overlapping, spoken in voices that sounded like they had been talking for a long time. They weren't yelling, but they were talking as if they had never stopped talking. Have you ever heard a sound that didn't scare you at first, but got heavier on you as you listened? That's what Virgil described later. Leave a comment if you know that feeling of slow-building fear that doesn't spike. He locked the mine door again and didn't go to sleep. In the morning, he wrote a letter to a geologist he had worked with when he was a surveyor. The geologist was 38 years old, had a rough mustache, and liked to hum to himself when he was thinking. Ashwood had spent years studying the sound properties of underground formations and had written a paper in 1919 about how certain mineral compositions could boost and sustain sound waves. Virgil needed a logical explanation because the other option was not something he was willing to accept. Ashwood arrived 2 weeks later, in the middle of November, with 2 crates of equipment and an energy that Virgil found both reassuring and tiring. He set up recording devices in the cellar, placed sensors along the foundation, and ran wires out to the sealed mine entrance for 3 nights. Doratha watched from the kitchen window with an interested look on her face. On the 4th night, Ashwood called Virgil into the cellar in a voice that didn't sound excited at all. "Listen to this," he said, playing back a recording he had made from the sensor closest to the mine shaft. The sound was clearer than anything Virgil had heard with his own ears. It was voices, maybe dozens of them, speaking in a rhythm that rose and fell with an... As the noise got louder and louder, one voice would sometimes rise above the others, a deeper, slower voice that seemed to be talking to the others. Ashwood looked at Virgil and said, "That's not geology." "I know," Virgil replied. "Sound doesn't behave this way. Even in the strangest sounding formations, you don't get sustained patterned vocalization over 40 years. The air pressure alone would have destroyed any trapped sound within weeks." "Then what is it?" Virgil asked. He didn't answer because the only answer he had was what Dora had told him the night he got there. "The ground here has started whispering." And she was right, it wasn't the wind, it wasn't the rocks, and it wasn't the sounds. It was something that wore all of those explanations as clothes, but wasn't any of them. Ashwood stayed for another week and mapped the sounds. During that time, he found something that made the situation much scarier. The sounds were not static. They were moving. The whispering started at the bottom of the collapsed mine shaft and was slowly, almost imperceptibly, rising to the surface and towards the house. When Ashwood left, he took his gear but left behind a single page of notes. Virgil read it by himself in the kitchen. The last line said, "I have no scientific explanation for what I have recorded. I think you should leave this place." But Virgil and the others did not leave. Doratha, because something else was happening now. It had started so slowly that neither of them noticed it until they could no longer deny it. Not all at once or in full words, but in pieces, they were starting to understand what was being said. A word here, a phrase there. It was like being immersed in a language, but the language was coming from the ground up, and the teachers had been kept in the dark for 40 years. Virgil knew what the first word meant: remember. On a Thursday night, he heard it while he was in bed looking at the water spot on the ceiling. The sound was as clear as if someone had said it from the hallway because it went through the floors like heat. Do not forget that Doratha heard it too. She told him over breakfast the next morning, her face tight and ready to speak. "It told me to remember, and I heard it clearly." After that, there were more of the words. There were never full sentences, demands, or threats. There were only bits and pieces that seemed like they were part of a talk that was going on. It had been going on for so long that it had worn lines into the ground, the dark. "Oh, I'm still down here. Remember that we waited?" Virgil started writing in a notebook. He wrote down every word he could figure out, along with the time, the room in the house where he heard it, and the direction it sounded like it came from. He wrote on 47 pages between December and January 1924. The words were always the same few, but they were used in different ways, like a language that had been pared down to its most basic parts. Important things. But at the end of January, a new word showed up: open. It was heard in the cellar by Virgil. It was heard in the kitchen by Doratha. It was Purnell Skaggs' job to bring groceries every Thursday. He heard it while standing outside by his truck and wouldn't go back inside. Open. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an order. It was something in the middle, something that was so heavy with patience that it felt like pressure. Virgil wrote to Oswin once more. This time, Oswin didn't answer. It was one of, "It's ever been that cold in that part of West Virginia." It snowed a lot, and the roads were closed for weeks at a time. There was no way for Virgil and Doratha to get in touch with anyone else, so the whispers got worse. No longer was it just the heroes who could do it. He could hear it in any room at any time by February. It had moved all the way from the mine shaft to the house, as if the voices had broken through the rock and dirt and moved in with the walls. The house had always been shaky and sighed because it was cold. Now, though, those sounds were different. They had a beat. They meant to do it. From over 30 years of living in this land, Dorotha had been through a lot of bad things. Then, things started to change for her. She took out the pins in her hair. She stopped writing in her exact typed style. She stood at the cellar door for hours, with her head turned just a bit, and listened without showing any fear. Yes, it was praise. He told her, "I think I know one of them," on a March night. There was finally less snow on the ground. While they were sitting by the fire, he heard something new in her words. It was smooth and soft. "One of them looks like Harlan to me." One of the 14 was Harlan Sable, who was married to Doratha and had worked in the Pendergast shaft as a child. It wasn't the weather. Virgil felt something cold move through him. He slowly told her, "Dorothea, Harlan has been gone for over 40 years. She replied, "I know how long he has been gone," and there was. Her voice didn't sound sad or crazy. It had a calm, terrible confidence to it. "Virgil, I know his voice, though. It's something I've heard every day for 12 years. Everything changed when Doratha said that the voices were from the men who were locked in the mine in 1882. It was no longer a question of what was making the noises. How was the question? More importantly, why now? Why did they start talking again after 40 years of silence?" Virgil thought about that question all spring of 1924. Question. Taking a trip to the county seat, he looked through papers. He sent letters to people who work in mines. He looked for people who were related to the Pentagast company. Piece by piece, he put together a picture that made him wish he had left as Oswin had told him to. The Pentagast hole wasn't like other mines. Virgil finally found the geological surveys from the 1870s in a storage room at the county building. They said that the rock formations under the Shaw property were strange. The minerals that are found at. The surveyors couldn't figure out what was in the deepest floors of the shaft. The thing they talked about was a dark, vitreous substance that was buried in the coal seams and wasn't anything in their sources. A surveyor's shaky handwriting on a piece of paper called it rock that seems to absorb lantern light rather than reflect it. When the final fall happened, the mine had been digging deeper into this strange layer. There was something wrong with the 14 guys who were trapped. Tunnel. They were in a part of the mine that had broken through into what the original studies called a void space. This was a natural cave below the coal seams that no one knew how big it was. Something had been there long before anyone brought a light down to see it. It was a place where nothing was there. When Virgil went back to the farm in June 1924, he knew this and felt more and more like he was getting close to something he couldn't get back from. While he was gone, the whispers didn't stop. In any case, as Doratha put it, it had become more organized and logical, as if the voices were coming together to send a single message. That was the first time Virgil heard that message. It was the night of June 21st, which was the longest day of the year. Someone was alone in the cellar, and there was one lit light on the stone floor. He could feel the whispering rising around him like water. This time, it didn't come in pieces. It was a single, clear message made by many voices at the same time, as if they were standing next to each other. Him. We can't leave because we found something down here. There was no light for a long time after the candle went out. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He did nothing but sit with those words and let them sink in like rocks dropped into deep water. He considered going away. All summer he thought about it every day, but he was held back. It's called being loyal to Dorotha. It was in the surveyor's nature to finish recording what he had begun. It was probably something less logical that the talking had, put in him that he couldn't figure out or pull out. Virgil made up his mind by the fall of 1924, a full year after he arrived. He would not go back into the mine by himself. He hired 2 men from a nearby county who had nothing to do with Mason County and didn't know anything about its past. Leland Mosby, 31, used to work as a coal miner. He had arms like bridge wires and was quiet, which made him easy to work with. And Rufus Dunleavy, 47, an expert in demolition who had spent the war clearing land in France, who dealt with everything with the coolness of someone who had already been through the worst thing that could happen to them. Rufus had a rough, deep scar on his right ear that went to the tip of his jaw. He never talked about it. They started working in October, carefully taking down the wooden barrier and adding new supports to the entrance to the hole to make it stronger. The air coming out of the mine was still moving and cold, but it had a new smell that Virgil could pick out, a faint mineral smell. Not place. It wasn't bad. It wasn't anything. There was something wrong with the smell. It wasn't one of the smells that nature had taught him. It took the 3 men 3 weeks to work their way inside. After going down a few hundred feet, the hole was mostly still there, but the rock got stranger as they went deeper. Near the opening, the walls were made of normal sandstone and shale. As you went further in, they got darker, denser, and smoother. By the time they got to the fork, the walls of the room where Virgil had stood a year before looked like glass, almost like liquid, as if the rock had been melted and then reformed. There was whispering all around. It was first heard by Leland. When he stopped swinging his pickaxe, he stood still. His huge body was stiff with a tension that Virgil could recognize. The tension of a man hearing something that his mind won't process. Leland said that something was talking. Rufus, who was looking at the supports for the tube ahead, he turned around with the light and didn't say anything. He knew Rufus heard it too, because Virgil saw his jaw get tighter around the scar. They kept going. After the junction, they picked the center tunnel because the original maps showed that it went the deepest into the hillside. The path got narrower and then wider, like they were moving through the body of a huge thing, going through chambers and tight spots that felt less like geology and more like anatomy. After going about a quarter mile, they came across the accident. From floor to ceiling, the cave was filled with a wall of broken rock and wood. Beyond it, Virgil could feel the empty space. He doesn't see it, he feels it. On the other side of the rubble, there was a huge void that felt like a deep breath being held. This is where the whispering was loudest. It came from the other side. Rufus looked at the fall with the eyes of a professional. He said, "We can clear this. It's been 2 or 3 days, but I need to tell you something." He stopped for a moment, and Virgil saw something in the face of the removal worker that he had never seen before. Fear's cousin, but not the same thing. Under the argon in the psalm, I have been in tunnels all over the world. There were places where men were buried alive and where things that should never have been created tore the earth apart. That being said, I've never felt anything like this before. He was asked what he meant. Rudolph said, "The air is wrong." It seems like something on the other side is pulling it toward the fall in the empty space. They set up camp that night in the junction room. They didn't sleep at all. No longer was the talking just a murmur or something in the background. It was a chorus. There were at least a dozen voices talking at the same time, in waves that filled the tunnels like a live current. And sometimes individual voices came through in that chorus. They were clear and recognized as human, but they also changed. Virgil had a hard time putting into words what they were like. It was like sounds that had been talking for a long time and were getting tired. Down to their core, stripped of their feelings and personalities and left with only speech. The word they used most, the one that stood out from the rest, was open, which Virgil had heard months before. Rufus and Leland worked to clear the fall over the next 2 days, while Virgil wrote down everything that happened. He drew the cave walls and noted that the minerals were becoming more and more strange. He wrote down the temperature, which dropped steadily as they went deeper, hitting levels. At that depth, that shouldn't have been possible. By measuring the wind, he confirmed what Rufus had seen. As if pulling it in, it was being pulled toward the empty space with a soft but steady force. They got through on the 3rd day. As the last stone fell, a mouth-like opening appeared in the empty space in front of them. Their lanterns shone about 20 feet into the darkness before the light stopped. It wasn't dimming. It was like the light hit a surface of pure black and was absorbed completely. The room, cave, or whatever it was called, went out in every direction past the range of their light. The floor was smooth and slightly curved, like the inside of a bowl. It was made of the same dark vitreous that they had seen on the walls of the tube. 14 forms were set up in a rough circle on that floor. These things were no longer bodies. They were something that used to be bodies but had changed over 40 years of being in the dark. They sat up straight, crossed their legs, and looked inward, as if they had planned how they were going to sit. Their shapes were whole but changed. The dark mineral that was on the walls looked like it had grown over the bones and skin, turning them into something that wasn't real or natural. They didn't say anything, but they were still. Like breath, the whispering came from their open lips, the spaces between their new ribs, and the smooth places where their faces used to be. Now that Virgil was on the edge of the circle, he could hear every word. They were telling tales. Every voice told. Not to the other people, but to the dark itself. They told stories about their lives, the surface, the sun and the rain, and the people they loved's faces. It was like they had been telling the void these memories for 40 years, and the void had been listening. He stood on the edge of the circle and felt something he couldn't put into words. It wasn't scary, it wasn't sadness. It felt like being with something so big and patient that human feelings were just not strong enough to describe it. Do it. Land was the first person to back off. He didn't say anything. With the calm, steady step of someone who has decided that what is behind him is not something he needs to understand, he turned and walked into the tunnel. Just for a moment, Rufus stood there. The scars on his face made it impossible to read in the lamplight. After that, he said in a low voice, "They are not trapped. They are keeping it company." The way he said that made sense to Virgil. There was something in the empty spot. It was never empty. Something was out there in the dark that their light couldn't reach. Something that was there before the mine, before the county, and before anyone walked these hills. Something that wasn't biologically alive, but still lived. It was lonely. It did the only thing it knew how to do when the mine broke through and 14 men fell into its reach. It had kept them, not in being mean or nasty, for the same reason that deep earth keeps fossils and stone keeps the shape of a leaf, it had. They were kept safe, and by doing so, they were changed into something that could live in its world and keep it company in the never-ending dark. The reason they were whispering wasn't to get help. but so that someone higher up would know. It was too late to save them, but remember that. The mine was locked again by Virgil. He used new wood and stone and worked on it by himself for 3 days straight, making the doorway stronger than it had ever been. Leland didn't say a word as he left the county. Rufus stayed for a day, helped with the sealing, and then gave Virgil a handshake that said more than he could have said. The High Queen did not ask what they found. Virgil and she met on the porch that night. She gave him a coffee and stood next to him while the sun went down. After some time, she said that Harlan always talked too much. It was the first time in months that she almost smiled. He stayed in Mason County. He didn't leave again. He lived in that house until the end of his days and heard the whispers every night, and over the years, he got a better sense of what they meant. Writing down the stories that the 14 men told the thing over and over again in the dark, he filled journal after journal with the words he heard. Some women laughed as they looked at the color of the fall leaves through the fog in the morning. Other women talked about picnics by the creek and the smell of fresh bread baking. No one ever heard what was down there. He never wrote about what he found. He just dealt with it the same way Doratha did, as the land itself had lived with it for thousands of years. She found Virgil's journals after he died in 1951 and read them all. It was 89 years old, and her hands were shaking as she turned the pages, but her eyes were still very sharp. She burned all but one journal. It was the last one, the one with one entry from December 3rd, 1947 that said, "I have listened for 24 years now, and tonight, for the first time, it spoke back, not through them, directly, one word. It said my name." Doratha closed that one, journal, buried it behind the smokehouse in a tin box. After 3 years, she died in her sleep in 1954. People bought that house, even though you could still hear whispers through the floors. They were the new owners for 8 months, the 4 that came after them. The house was eventually left empty, and the land was given back to the county. Since the county didn't need it, they let it go back to the forest. Today, there would be nothing there if you drove through that part of West Virginia. Not a house or a barn. There is no mine entrance. There are only hills, trees, and a noise that makes your ears hurt. You might feel it if you stood there long enough in the right place at the right time. That faint tremor, that murmur beneath the murmur. 14 people are still telling their stories to something that has time to hear them. Now there's one more voice calling out a name. It could be yours. That's the end of the story. It might not end at all, though. It might still be going under those right now. Under the hills, under the dark, and under everything we think we know about what the earth is made of. I want to know if you have ever stood somewhere and felt the ground hum. Enter it in the box below. I think there are more places like Mason County than people want to admit. Tell me where you were and how you felt. Don't leave until the next one. This has been your fear up until now. Do not pay too much attention to the silence no matter what.